Hi, John.
Hi, Bruce.
How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Nice of you to join us here on Blogging Heads. As someone who's been down this road a few times, let me take a second, introduce myself, and introduce you. My name is Bruce Feiler, as you know. I am speaking to you from Brooklyn today, your hometown, and I'm the author of a number of books. Most recently, I spent a decade retracing the Bible through the Middle East. I've written 3 books about that: Walking the Bible, Abraham, and Where God Was Born. I'm also the host of Walking the Bible on PBS. And I blog at FeilerFaster.com, which is hosted on BeliefNet. And I think because I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, both in Israel and in the Muslim world, and because of a kind of general interest I have in these topics, they've asked me to welcome you and to talk to you about your book. You are John Mearsheimer. If I can get your full title correct, you are the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the coordinator of the Program on International Security Policy at the University of Chicago. You are a well-known realist in the area of international relations, and you've written a number of books, including The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And with your colleague, Stephen Walt, who is a professor of international affairs at the Kennedy School at Harvard, you have written what is surely the most talked about book on American foreign policy this year and probably for several years, and I'm going to hold it up here and see if this camera will capture it. It, of course, is The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. The book was published this fall, became a New York Times bestseller, and is the outgrowth of several years of writings and conversation and controversy that have accompanied this idea, and we're going to unpack a fair bit of that today. So let me just begin by saying hello and welcome. Thank you for making this happen.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this program. I appreciate it greatly.
I'm delighted. One of the kind of trademarks of blogging heads is that they like to pair people who have a kind of natural, different way of looking at the world. Often it kind of falls along the left-right political axis. Sometimes it falls on different parts of the world. Someone who perhaps is engaged on the ground in a conflict, spoken to and engaged with someone in this country. If I could frame the conversation you and I are about to have, I think that what we share is an interest in a lot of these topics, but perhaps where we might be different is in our writing styles, and that you come out of an academic tradition, a highly distinguished academic tradition, and I come out of a personal narrative tradition. And that a lot of my writings on this theme and on many themes in the 20 years that I've been writing have to do with traveling, going to the ground, talking to the people, and using, and if you will, kind of bringing myself into the process and using a subjective point of view rather than an objective point of view. And so with that preamble, that in some ways, with your indulgence, is how I'd like to shape this conversation. So we were going to talk about your ideas, so in that sense we're going to be on your side of the court, but I would like to do it, if possible, and when appropriate, in the context of the personal narrative, because that is, it seems to me, a way that I've not seen you engaged in a lot of the writing that I have done, the reading that I have done. And we're going to get to your book and to the story of it that is quite well known to many of our viewers and listeners. But let me begin by just saying, we almost did this about a month ago, but you were traveling in Europe to launch the Israel Lobby. And just to refresh those of you who are not familiar with the story, it was originally published, was commissioned a number of years ago. We're going to get into that. Was published in the London Review of Books in the spring of 2006. Created this enormous outcry of both interest and controversy. And then you did a lot of talking, and we will link on Blogging Heads to a lot of the commentary. And then you expanded the article and created it as a book. The book was published in this country, and you've just come from launching the book in Europe. So since I've not seen you on the record about this, tell me a little about where did you go, and how would you characterize the difference of how the book was received in Europe as opposed to how it's been received here in the United States?
Well, we started in Paris, and we went from there to London, to Oxford, to Amsterdam, to Vienna, then to Frankfurt, then to Berlin, then to Milan, Italy, then to Rome, then back to Milan, and then to Madrid.
Sounds like a bus tour with lots of tourists.
It was a lot of different places, and in many of those places we were not there for more than a day. The question of how we were received in Europe versus the United States is a very interesting one, and Steve Walt and I talked a lot about this during the course of our visit in Europe. I think it's fair to say that at the popular level, there was hardly any difference in how we were received in Europe as compared to the United States. We find that here in the United States, when we go to places like San Francisco or Dallas and talk to large audiences, that we're very well received, that most of the people in the audience are with us. They might not agree with everything we say, but they agree with most of what we say. And they're very pleased that we are talking about this subject for once. And that's pretty much the same situation in Europe. We were well received everywhere we went. This is not to say that either in Europe or the United States there weren't people in the audience who disagreed with us in fundamental ways. There were in both cases. I'd say about 10% of the audience, maybe 5% in some cases. And those people asked hard questions, which is perfectly legitimate, and we actually enjoy that. The real difference between Europe and the United States is at the elite level. In the United States, at the elite level, I think it's fair to say that we have been clobbered coming and going.
That seems fair to say, actually. I think that's a gentle characterization of what's happened.
Yes, I think almost all the reviews have been, I would call them unfair, but certainly negative. And in Europe, it's been a very different story. Indeed, in Israel, it's been a very different story. We like to tell people that the single most favorable review that we've received came from Israel. And in Haaretz, which is effectively the New York Times of Israel, there have been 3 big pieces, including one major review on our book. And all 3 of those pieces were favorable, and the major review was very favorable.
So back to Europe for a second. It's a kind of almost conventional wisdom in the American Jewish community in the United States that there is a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and we're going to talk about the idea of anti-Semitism a little bit later. Does that? And I personally have kind of problems with that because when I hear Europe, I hear a conflation of traditional anti-Semitism as we understand it with kind of anti-Zionism, if you will, or an anti-Israel attitude. But would you say that your experience would support the conventional wisdom or challenge it?
It would challenge the conventional wisdom. I think there's no question that there is a great deal of criticism of Israeli policy in Europe, not criticism of Israel itself or any questioning of the legitimacy of Israel. That may be true in some of the Muslim populations in the various countries of Europe. But among most Europeans, I think it's widely accepted that Israel is here to stay, and that's basically a good thing. People are just very critical of Israeli policy. I did not see much evidence of anti-Semitism. This is not to say that there aren't anti-Semites in Europe, just like there are anti-Semites in the United States. But I had no sense that this is a situation that's akin to the 1930s, which of course is an argument that you hear quite often from supporters of Israel.
Do you think that, let me just ask you then directly, do you think that there is a greater willingness, an openness in criticizing Israel in Europe because the Israel lobby that you address in your book is simply not as strong there as it is in the United States?
There's no question that that's what's going on here. In Europe, there is less willingness to criticize Israel because of history. Because of the Holocaust and because of the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, many Europeans are actually surprisingly reluctant to criticize Israel publicly. For example, when we were in Holland, a number of people said that because Holland turned over more Jews to the Germans than any other European country, it felt a profound sense of guilt, and therefore many Dutch people were reluctant to criticize Israel. But at the same time, the lobby is much less influential or much less powerful in Europe than it is in the United States, and therefore people are willing at the elite level or in the mainstream media to criticize Israel in ways that is not the case in the United States. The United States is really sui generis. It's quite remarkable how little critical discussion there is of Israeli policy or the U.S.-Israeli relationship in this country.
Okay, well, we're going to get into that. Before we do, I want to go back to this personal narrative thing. I've been surprised that in all that I've read, and I've now read the original article in the London Review of Books, I've read your book, I've read many of the reviews, and anybody who wants, actually Wikipedia I think has done quite a good job of accumulating, and they actually divide the reviews into favorable, moderate, and critical, which is I think a helpful thing I'd never seen on Wikipedia before. I've actually not seen a lot of talk about your personal background, and I'm surprised, given that a lot of what you write about is the connection between people's personal backgrounds and their policy points of view, that has not come up. So I'd like to just engage you on that for a few minutes before we get to the key ideas in the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy. So you mentioned before we came on the air, and I read it everywhere on the internet, that you grew up in Brooklyn. I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn now. What's your religious background?
I was raised as a Catholic. And I went to church every Sunday until I graduated from high school.
And what year were you born?
I was born in 1947, the second year of the baby boom. My father went into the American military in 1942. He graduated from City College in New York in the summer of 1942, and then went into the Army Air Corps. And then when the war was over with, he came home, married my mother, in 1946, and then I was born in 1947. I was the first of 5 children.
So that means that you would have been in high school during Vatican II, which one of the things that Vatican II did was change the orientation of the Catholic Church toward Jews and toward the Hebrew Bible. And I should say at this point, perhaps I should have said this in advance of asking you some personal questions, that I'm a fifth-generation Jew from the American South, and a lot of the themes of my books have been about re-engaging the Bible and understanding the correlation between religion and public life in the United States and around the world. I'm actually just finishing a book this month that's about the relationship between the Bible and the United States, that's called How Moses Created America, that looks at the influence of the Exodus story and Moses as inspiration to generation after generation of Americans, from the Pilgrims to the Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement. So so this is something that's particularly interesting to me. So Vatican II...
Bruce, can I just say something about Vatican II and my religious views in general? The truth of the matter is, for reasons I can't put my finger on, I've never had any interest in religion. Mm-hmm. And although I went to church, I went not because I found it interesting or I felt like I needed it for intellectual reasons or for any other reasons. I went because my parents told me I had to go to church every Sunday. And if they had said to me, "You don't have to go to church, John," I would not have gone to church. The fact of the matter is I know remarkably little about religion. I admire the fact that you know so much, and I wish I could sit around and talk to you and learn more about religion. But I was not a Catholic in any meaningful sense of the term, and it was not because I was hostile to the Catholic religion. It's just because I found religion remarkably boring. I always used to say when I was a kid that I couldn't believe that people killed themselves over religious differences. It just seems so trivial to me. So I was raised as a Catholic, but the truth is I was never a Catholic in any meaningful sense.
So when you then went to West Point. Now there's been a kind of controversy in recent years with the U.S. service academies and their relationship to religion, and one of the things that interests me actually about the military is how the chaplains are kind of pioneers of interfaith relations, because out in the field the chaplains carry little packets with different religious prayers and gestures that they can do if people are dying. So did this come up when you were at the Naval Academy, which obviously was a seminal event in your understanding and formulation of your views on American foreign policy?
Yeah, I was actually at the Military Academy, not the Naval Academy.
I'm sorry, that's my...
Yeah, no, although I did have a brother.
I got the Annapolis conference on my mind. You were at West Point, I should qualify, yes.
My brother Tom went to the Naval Academy, and I have a sister who went to West Point. But actually, I was in the last class at West Point that had mandatory chapel. It was a number of graduates of the class of 1970 from West Point and from the Air Force Academy who challenged mandatory chapel in the courts, and mandatory chapel was eliminated afterwards. But when I was at West Point, going to church or going to synagogue, depending on your religion, was part of the program there. And everybody went to church or a synagogue every Sunday, and I did as well. And it was much like growing up as a kid in New York, where my parents made me go to church. But I had no more interest in religion at West Point than I had when I was a kid growing up in New York. Again, not because I disliked religion, but just because I found it so boring.
So let me ask you this. I've seen you describe yourself at some point, and I can't remember if it's in your book. I've been marinating myself in this controversy the last week or so. I've seen you describe yourself as a philo-Semite. I mean, what did you mean by that term?
I grew up in a very Jewish world. I grew up in New York. Many of my best friends growing up were Jewish, and many of my parents' best friends were Jewish. And then, of course, I went into the academic world where there are large numbers of Jews, and I constantly rubbed shoulders with them, and I always had great admiration for Jewish culture and had lots of close friendships with Jews.
So here's the reason I'm asking about this, and from this, why don't we then move into a little bit of the conception of the idea behind the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy, and I'm trying to use the whole title here, even though it's commonly referred to as the Israel lobby. And that is, I've read the origin story a couple of times, and of how the conventional story of how it came about, and I'll let you expand it. That you were realists, following your distinguished academic careers. You encountered the group of revisionist historians in Israel who were kind of describing a different way of looking at the history of the founding of the State of Israel. And then you were growing frustrated with what was going on in American foreign policy in the Middle East, and this idea came to you, and as I have read, then you sought out your colleague Stephen Walt because you thought that advancing these ideas on your own would just open you up to too much exposure. But what I don't understand is that this, when you read the book, as I have just done, it's clear that this is a deep-rooted, passionate conviction that you both share. I can't distinguish between the voices in the book. And it seems to me that it must have been coming for a long time.
Not really. Let me tell a slightly different version of the history than you did.
Please, you know better than I.
There's no question that in the 1990s, when I was first exposed to what the Israeli new historians were writing, that I began to change my thinking on how the State of Israel was created. I believed as a young boy and as a young man the Exodus myths, where Israel was portrayed in a very heroic light, and the Arabs were portrayed.
As someone who writes about the Exodus, you mean the novel, The Exodus?
Yes, excuse me. Right, Leon Uris's famous novel, Exodus, which I read a handful of times as a young boy and was deeply impressed by. And that novel, of course, which shaped the thinking of many people of my generation on the Middle East, portrayed the Israelis as the good guys, or the Zionists, and then later the Israelis as the good guys, and the Arabs or the Palestinians as the bad guys. And the new historians basically overturned that narrative, and they made it clear.
They challenged it, yeah.
Yeah, they challenged it, and I was heavily influenced by that in the 1990s. But that didn't cause me to go out and write about the Israel lobby. What caused me and Steve, somewhat independently, to start thinking about the lobby and U.S. foreign policy was 9/11. As you well know, in the wake of 9/11, all international relations specialists began to focus on the Middle East and asked the simple question, what went wrong? Mm-hmm. And in looking at U.S. policy in the region, it became clear to me, and it became clear to Steve. It was probably clear to Steve long before 9/11, because he had written a book on this, on a related subject, that the lobby had a profound influence on our Middle East policy, and that wasn't necessarily a positive thing. And nevertheless, hardly anybody talked about this in the United States. It became very clear very quickly to me that this was a taboo subject. And Steve and I agreed in the spring of 2002 that it would be a good idea if we could write something on it. So he and I were headed in that direction before I had a conversation with The Atlantic in the fall of 2002, where they asked me if I would be willing to write an article on the subject.
Okay, so Colin Murphy commissions this article. It takes you several years. You go back and forth as you relay the story in the book. And then it was killed, and nobody seems to know why. Why was it killed?
Well, we believe that it was killed in large part because they got cold feet. We believe that they realized that the article would cause a firestorm and that it would not be good for the Atlantic, and therefore they walked away from it. Now, we have no hard evidence to support that interpretation.
Do you have reason to believe that a pressure, either unofficial or ownership pressure, the kind of which you discuss openly in your book, was applied in your case?
I have no idea whether that's true or not. I don't know what the decision-making process looked like inside the Atlantic. I'm just quite certain that they got cold feet.
Right.
And one could argue, given what happened in the wake of the publication of the piece by the London Review of Books, that they made the right decision.
So the book comes out...
As you well know, all magazines in the United States operate on a narrow profit margin. In fact, some of them operate in the red.
Yeah.
And you write an article or you publish an article like that, it can have severe consequences. But you would have to ask Colin Murphy and the folks at The Atlantic exactly what the decision-making process looked like.
Now, and that was in the wake when the Atlantic had lost its editor, and it was a period of turmoil, and I have no access to them and no knowledge of this. So let me then move on to the article does come out in the London Review of Books. Was it April 2006? Do I have the month right?
It was March 2006.
March 2006. Created this storm and controversy, and yet another question here before I get into the ideas in the book, and I'm going to get there, don't worry, and that is, you said, we have all this stuff, we should write a book. Well, now we're in the summer of 2006. This book comes out in the fall, or in the early fall of 2007. I mean, it's probably a 120,000-word book up from an article that is much shorter. How did you do that? And I'm specifically interested in the question of when you did it, knowing the controversy that would come your way, did you approach the methodology in a different way than you would have with your academic books?
Well, there are a couple questions embedded in that general question.
Correct.
We basically decided in the summer of 2006 that we probably ought to do a book, and then we got a contract with FSG, and in the early fall of 2006, we began to go to work. We worked extremely hard over the next 8 months to produce the book. Steve and I had not planned this, but we both were on sabbatical that year.
Oh, I see.
So we had an enormous amount of free time to write the book. I mean, if we hadn't been on sabbatical, both of us, we couldn't have done the book. Second point you want to keep in mind is that the first version of the article that we submitted to The Atlantic was actually a small book. We wrote a small book for The Atlantic. They understood what we were doing, and we understood that we would cut it down into article form. But anyway, all of that is to say that we had a lot of raw material there by the fall of 2006. Furthermore, we had written the article, we had written an 80-page response to our critics, so we knew what all the criticisms would be of the book, and we were well prepared to build in the counters to those arguments. So we were in pretty good shape to produce a rather lengthy book in a short period of time.
But here's what I'm asking. I want to get to the other question that was embedded in my question. And because certainly one of the things that you have been most consistently criticized about is that that the book is not written to an academic standard. Now, here I'm the popular writer talking to the academic writer. I mean, one of the shocking things for me is there's no charts in this book. There's no... I keep longing for the concrete information that you are summarizing. There's 100 pages of notes, so you certainly have that. But I'm curious, did you write it specifically for a popular audience differently than you would have done some peer review academic book that you would have written?
We didn't think of it that way. We just thought this was an important subject, and the way to answer it was the way we wrote the book. I mean, a book that has well over 100 pages of footnotes does look an awful lot like an academic book. The book is organized pretty much the way we write our academic books. I think if you look at The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, or Steve's book on Taming American Power, that there's not a whole heck of a lot of difference between those two books and the book on the Israel lobby. I mean, the basic argument that people are making here is that this is sloppy scholarship, that here are two renowned scholars who went out and wrote a sloppy book. And this is a not very convincing argument. First of all, Steve and I have each written 3 books and countless articles, and although almost all of what we have written has generated controversy, nobody has ever accused us of sloppy scholarship. Does it make sense that when we finally decide to jump into a bucket of water and then give the third rail a full-body embrace, that's when we decide to do sloppy scholarship? Of course not. And furthermore, do you think that Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, which was putting its reputation on the line, would allow us to write a sloppy book? Indeed, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux went to enormous lengths to make sure that we got this book right. Eric Chinsky, who was our editor, was a superb editor. He reviewed the manuscript 3 separate times, and at one point, Steve, Eric, and I spent the whole week in Boston going over every word of the manuscript. Moreover, Steve and I paid $16,000 out of our own pockets to hire 2 fact checkers, 2 of the best fact checkers out there. We had a handful of first-class academics and former policymakers read the manuscript. One person gave us 55 single-space pages of comments. I could go on and on.
Okay, good. Now, this is helpful to me because
the idea that this was a sloppy piece of...
What I'm hearing is you're comfortable with it being evaluated as an academic book. You're not claiming it should be judged by different standards. Everybody can have their reactions, obviously, and they are, but you're not saying it's a different creature.
I don't see any different sets of criteria that would be used for evaluating an academic book versus a popular book. The question is, do you have a clear argument and do you make your case? People can disagree with us. They can say that we're wrong on this point, that our interpretation about point B or point C is incorrect. That's fine. That happens all the time. My point to you, Bruce, is that the argument that this is sloppy scholarship and that we wrote a book that doesn't measure up to normal academic standards is, I think, a bogus argument.
Okay, let's go. The book is called, and I'll hold it up here. I'm Bruce Feiler, and I'm talking to John Mearsheimer, and we are talking about your new New York Times bestselling book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. It's written with your colleague Stephen Walt at Harvard, and I want to take the third word before the second. I want to deal with the word lobby before we deal with the word Israel. You mentioned, and I was quite struck actually when I read the book, that the way you outline it, let me just read the chapters here for those who have not looked at the book, is divided into 2 parts. One, the United States, Israel, and the lobby. The second, the lobby in action. And the second part basically looks at the issues of Israel that the lobby has engaged on, the Palestinians, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. The first part is... in some ways where a lot of the attention has focused, and it is really where you talk about the role of the United States in supporting Israel. You raise the question, you basically say it is kind of de facto an assumption in American life that Israel is a strategic asset. You firmly state the argument that it in fact is a strategic liability. You then go on to say that therefore you can't use the asset argument to support Israel. How about the moral argument? You investigate in Chapter 3 the moral argument, find that to be lacking, and then say, well, what explains the support? And your answer is in large part the Israel lobby. And you then, in a chapter, define the Israel lobby and then talk about the 2 ways that the lobby attempts to influence American life, one through the policy process in Washington and one through the public discourse. Is that a fair kind of summary of the way you've outlined and set up the ideas?
I think it's an excellent summary with one minor caveat,
okay.
And that is that we're trying to explain the special relationship that exists between the United States and Israel. We think there's a powerful moral case for supporting the existence of Israel, and we believe that if Israel's existence is threatened, that the United States should come to its aid. But that's not the issue on the table. The question is, given all of the aid that we give to Israel, including diplomatic support, military equipment, and financial aid, given all that, and given the fact that we give it unconditionally, how can you explain it? And, of course, as you pointed out, we go through the various explanations that Israel's a strategic asset or that there's a moral rationale for this support, and we show that those arguments don't hold much water and that, in fact, it's due to the lobby.
Lobby. Let's take the word lobby. You mentioned the Federalist Papers, James Madison, the United States system, constitutional system. One of its geniuses and occasional frustrations is that it is built around an idea of groups, large or small, exerting influence on the public policy process. So you've got no problem with lobbying.
No, I mean, lobby is synonymous with interest group, and interest group politics has been at the heart of the American political system since the founding of this country. Our basic argument is that the Israel lobby is just a normal interest group, like the National Rifle Association, the Farm Lobby, the Cuban Lobby, the American Association of Retired People. There's nothing abnormal about the Israel lobby. It's not a cabal. It's not a conspiracy. It's just an interest group, and it's acting much the way other interest groups act. And this is just part of the warp and woof of daily life in the American political system.
Okay, you asked me in an email that as we were getting to know each other, and we've never met. Anybody's watching, and just so everybody knows, I'm a freelance person sitting in my home office. I don't work for a think tank. I'm not affiliated with a university. I'm a writer. All of my ideas and views. It's actually, my wife happens to be in South Africa on business. I've been reading this book the last 3 days. I've actually not spoken to a single person about it. So this is just, I'm giving you my unfiltered opinion. You asked me in email, what'd you think of the book? And I would say that my general reaction was there were parts where I was cheering you on. Stand on top of the bed, raise my arms, saying you were asking questions. These are vital things that I think should be talked about. I'm going to get into some of those a little bit later. I'll just say off the top of my head, I think talking about the influence of Aipac, I think is much needed, powerful, very interesting conversation. As a Jew, as someone who lived in Israel for a brief period of time, as somebody, again, I'm going to put all my biases out here on the table, who spent the last 10 years traveling through the region. I've probably been to Israel a dozen times. I've been to Egypt certainly more than that. I've been to Jordan. I went to Iraq in the middle of the war. I've been to Iran twice. I've been to Turkey half a dozen times. I've spent an enormous percentage of my professional life in the last 10 years in the Muslim world. And therefore I've heard a lot of these criticisms about Israel. So there were things I was cheering you on about. Aipac, I thought your discussion of the use of the anti-Semitism card in the Jewish community was very valuable. I thought a lot of the stuff late about the influence, late in your book, the influence of the neoconservatives and their relationship with Israel and Judaism and the lead up to the war in Iran, very interesting stuff. A lot of it I'd not seen before, really laid out. There's a couple of things that frustrated me a number of times that to me are kind of related to some of the criticisms you've gotten about some of the ideas, like you called the attack on Carter's book a smear campaign, which if I had been asked to give you notes, I would have said maybe you can use some other word. There's a couple of things like that I can see pressing the buttons of some of your critics. And there's a number of things where I'm really scratching my head, and I want to get to those things in a minute. But I got to ask you about the number one thing I'm scratching my head about, John, and that is, what is the Israel lobby? I have now read the book, the original article, all the commentary. I don't really get it. I understand AIPAC. I understand organized lobbying groups in Washington, but beyond that, I don't really understand it, because you mentioned Charles Krauthammer, for example, Mort Zuckerman, Marty Peretz. These are people involved, either businessmen in journalism or journalists themselves. And okay, I just got real questions about how far you define it. So what is the Israel lobby?
Well, our basic argument is that the Israel lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and groups that work actively to push U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. We go to great lengths to say it's not a cabal, it's not a conspiracy.
Yeah, these are all the criticisms. These are all the criticisms you took the first time around. But here's what I'm trying to get at: is anybody who's pro-Israel part of the pro-Israel lobby?
No, and we say explicitly that that's not the case. To be part of the Israel lobby, you have to work actively to push U.S. Middle East policy in a pro-Israel direction. And we say explicitly that anybody who is simply pro-Israel is not part of the lobby.
But Charles Krautheimer, for example, you say is clearly part of it. It's one of the examples you give in the defining paragraph. And yet, what about Tom Friedman? I mean, Tom Friedman, you say clearly is not part of it, but Tom Friedman has written widely about these topics. He was certainly one of the strongest advocates for the spread democracy across the Middle East argument to go into the war in Iraq. Well, why Krautheimer and not Friedman, for example?
Look, the basic point here is, Bruce, that it's always easy to define people who fit neatly in the lobby and people who don't fit in the lobby. In other words, you can take someone like Rashid Halidi. He obviously doesn't fit in the lobby. And
he's a professor at Columbia. And for those of you, he's a professor at Columbia. He holds, I think, the Edward Said chair.
Right.
So he's an open, vocal supporter of the Palestinians and is often been critical, by the way, not only about Israel, but also about Palestinian leadership.
That's correct. And I, by the way, would describe Rashid Halidi as pro-Israel. I don't think he's anti-Israel. I mean, he's critical of Israeli policy, for sure. But anyway, he obviously doesn't fit in the lobby. And someone like Mort Zuckerman, who was the head of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, clearly does fit in the lobby. There are going to be some people who are hard to categorize. And I think, there are even organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, which is hard to categorize. And we talk about that in the book. And that would be true of any lobby. If you were talking about the environmental lobby, there are going to be some organizations like Greenpeace that fit squarely in it, and some organizations and individuals that don't, then others that are rather hard to categorize. But this is not unusual when you're trying to define interest groups or lobbies, and you see it reflected in all the literature on interest groups and lobbies.
But here's the thing that I find frustrating, that when you're dealing with a definition that is a loose coalition, and it was interesting to me, by the way, that in the original article you said a loose coalition that tries to steer U.S. policy, whereas in the book you changed it to move. I think that's an acknowledgement of some of the criticism you took the first time around, which I respect, actually, that you made.
We did change some of the language.
Yeah.
I don't think we consciously changed the language from steer to move, or from move to steer, whatever it was, because we thought the original language there was inflammatory or not felicitous. I mean, there was some language that we regretted using, for sure, and we didn't intend it that way. I mean, as you know, we got criticized for capitalizing the L, Israel lobby, and afterwards we regretted doing that. It wasn't a conscious decision. I mean, it wasn't like we had a big debate on whether to capitalize the L or not, and we decided to do it for reason X, Y, or Z. We just sort of did it. And then when people pointed it out, that it sort of made it look like it was centralized and people did have membership cards.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate point, actually. And I think you were smart to change that. I respect that. So I just want to say, again, my reaction here, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated because I find myself writing down, well, if Charles Krautheimer writes about gun policy in favor of gun ownership, therefore, is he part of the gun lobby? I might even find myself jotting down, am I part of the Israel lobby? I've been to Israel. I made a television show, Walking the Bible, that encourages people to travel. I mean, I even saw in Foreign Affairs that Walter Mead said, are you part of the Israel lobby? You've said you support the moral existence of Israel. I think the softness is part of the problem.
I don't know what to say. I disagree with that. Again, I'm not part of the Israel lobby because I don't work actively to promote, to push U.S. Middle East policy in a pro-Israel direction. I am pro-Israel. I'm not opposed to the existence of the State of Israel. In fact, I think it's wonderful that there's a Jewish state. And again, as I made clear, both Steve and I believe that if its existence is threatened, the United States should come to its rescue. But I'm not part of the lobby. I do think that someone like Charles Krauthammer does work actively to push U.S. Middle East policy in a pro-Israel direction. And by the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, I got you. Okay, another thing I found missing. Why did you not write about the federations? Most American Jews, I would suggest, and I grew up as a fifth-generation Jew, Reform Jew in the American South in Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the third oldest synagogue in the United States. I would say I grew up ambivalent about Zionism, not a particularly Zionist family. Like a lot of Reform Jews, I was and have been and continue to be troubled by Israel's ambivalence toward Reform Judaism, and because of the control of the right-wing parties, religious parties on public life in Israel. Most Israeli Jews, when they want to get married, have to leave the country if they want to have a religious ceremony or do a civil ceremony, because religion is very messed up in Israel right now. Most American Jews encounter Israel not through the lobby, I would say, but through the federations, which are fundraising organizations extremely powerful that give social support to social organizations and indirectly support and help sustain Israel. Why not talk about the federations?
Well, the fact is, Bruce, there were many subjects that we could have talked about that we found fascinating, and that's one of them, but we didn't because of space constraints and the fact that we didn't think it added much to our argument. I mean, we may have been wrong on that, but I don't see where talking about the federations would have changed the basic thrust of the argument one way or the other.
Well, I think one of the reasons it might have is because I'm just saying, as a Jew who travels in this world a little bit, I'm just talking about what I recognized and what I didn't recognize in the book. And I didn't recognize in the book necessarily most American Jews' relationship with Israel. And that it would seem alien to a lot of Jews because the way that their chief point of reference to Israel is supporting Israel. They are pro-Israel in your definition, but that's very different.
That's not true.
But they're pro-Israel in a general way, I'm suggesting, but they are not Israel right or wrong. My problem with Aipac is Israel right or wrong. And that is a little bit the problem that sometimes I have with your argument, which was it seems to miss the nuance in the Jewish community and their attitudes toward Israel.
Well, I would just say we were aware of that criticism after we wrote the article and before we wrote the book. Okay. So we tried to head that problem off at the pass. Maybe we weren't successful, but let me just say a few words about it.
Sure.
First of all, we made it clear in the book that if you look at surveys of the American Jewish community, that about 1/3 of American Jews do not feel any significant attachment to Israel one way or the other.
That seems to make sense, yeah.
So we were not arguing that all Jews are deeply committed to Israel and all Jews are part of the Israel lobby. And as you know, this is one of the reasons, just one of the reasons we didn't refer to it as a Jewish lobby. So we understood from the get-go that many Jews don't feel a significant or meaningful attachment to Israel. We also pointed out that many Jews simply could not be categorized as part of the lobby because even if they do feel some attachment to Israel, they don't work actively to push U.S. Middle East policy in a pro-Israel direction. Furthermore, we did go to some lengths to try and make it clear that we thought there was significant variation inside the lobby on particular policy issues, especially the question of whether or not a two-state solution was desirable.
Yeah.
So in the book, we tried to address the criticism that we were not paying enough attention to the variations that existed inside the lobby. So I would just say that the criticism you're making is one that we heard loudly and clearly and tried to address.
So let's move from lobbying here to the Israel part of it. And one of the interesting things I found in the book that I had not seen in the article as much, and nor in the commentary that followed that, was that there's a very interesting section in the book where you talk about that you say that Israel was a strategic asset to the United States during the Cold War, and you analyze that in a very thorough way that I think plays to your strengths, both of your strengths as understanders of American realism and the kind of moving of realistic kind of statecraft for national interest. So what's interesting, the way I have interpreted that, and it's a little bit different from how you interpret it, but the way I interpreted that to mean, okay, so we're really, it's now, what is it, we're still in late November when you and I are taking this. It was 18 years ago this month that the Berlin Wall fell down. It took a couple of years for the Soviet Union to finally collapse. And so we're really, and so in other words, you're with the Israel lobby until then. You don't feel it had unjustified strength necessarily. So we're really only talking about a, say, 15-year period where you think that this influence is outsized to its usefulness to American national interest, which is not something I heard you say, and I don't think you actually really do say it, and you're actually even somewhat respectful of the role of Israel during the Oslo process during the 90s. So really, it's not that long. I mean, a lot of me thinks that really what this book boils down to is you think the Israel lobby got us into Iraq and you're frustrated and you've kind of blown the whole idea up. So,
I mean, a number of people have made that point, and in fact, Les Gelb made that argument in his review of our book in the New York Times, and we wrote a letter to the Times and told him that that was not true. And what I said, or what we said in the letter, is consistent with what I said to you earlier in the interview, which is that we decided to write about the Israel lobby in U.S. foreign policy in the spring of 2002, at a time when we didn't even think there was a serious possibility that the United States would invade Iraq. And then we wrote the piece, we were commissioned to write the piece in the fall of 2002, well before the United States invaded Iraq, and actually at a time when it still wasn't terribly clear that the United States would be foolish enough to invade Iraq. So the idea that we got this bee in our bonnet because of what's happened in Iraq is simply not true.
So here's the reason I'm raising that, which is actually not to go to that point, but to go on something else I expected to see in your book and I didn't, which was Balfour. You obviously mentioned the Balfour doctrine in 1914, but the reason I bring it up is, isn't Israel one of the few countries in the history of the world that was founded by a lobby? I mean, in other words, hasn't lobbying been central to Israel all along? And therefore, doesn't it really show that ultimately Israel is a realist's dream? Because it was created, yes, it was furthered by the Holocaust and by European and guilt and this concern about what to do with these refugees, but really it went in place far before the politics, and it was the Zionist lobby. Fundamentally, Israel is all about the lobby. This problem...
I think there's no question the early Zionists paid great attention to winning the support of Britain. It's quite clear that after World War I, Britain was effectively in charge of Mandate Palestine, and therefore you had three key actors at play. One were the Palestinian Arabs, two were the Zionists, and three were the British. And the Zionists went to great lengths to make sure that the British were on their side as much as possible. And there's no question that British Jews, people like Chaim Weizmann, went to considerable lengths to get Britain to back the Jews or the Zionists over the Palestinians, and that helped. But I think the key to creating the Jewish state in 1948, or between 1900 and 1948, was not so much the efforts of the Chaim Weizmanns of the world or the British. It was the ingenuity and the tremendous competence of the founding fathers of Israel, or more generally, the early Zionists. These were remarkably smart and driven people. And between 1900 and 1948, they put into place all the essentials of a state, including military forces, so that when the British finally left in 1948, they were well positioned to defeat, number one, the Palestinians, and then 5 separate armies from the Arab world that attacked into the new state of Israel after May 15th, 1948. But the British, I think, didn't matter that much. They mattered for sure, but they didn't matter that much. It's like people who say that there wouldn't have been a state of Israel had the United States not recognized Israel in 1948. I don't think that's true either. In fact, you almost had a state in 1937.
So here's why I'm going down this road, and that is, so lobbying has been central, whatever, or a good part is a phrase you use a lot. It was part of the mix, and you've just said that you didn't think it's as much part perhaps as I'm suggesting. There was clearly lobbying, we know, going on in some form between 1948 and the collapse of the Cold War, sometimes successfully, as you discuss in your book, sometimes unsuccessfully, whether it was Reagan selling arms to Saudi Arabia or Carter pushing Carter pushing forcing
Malcolm Bacon.
Yeah, no, I was going to say to give back Sinai. I mean, these. And then it was clearly there in the 1990s, as you discussed, sometimes to some success, but there was a lot of frustration among the members of the Jewish lobby about
Israel lobby.
I'm sorry, Israel lobby. I apologize. Toward Clinton, I'm thinking faster than I'm talking here. Isn't part of your gripe here not with the Israel lobby? It's just that in the Bush administration, you suddenly had a neoconservative population in key government divisions, in the White House, in the Vice President's house, in the Vice President's office, in the State Department, in public policy decisions, in less than the State Department perhaps, in defense. So why are you blaming the Israel lobby? The fact that finally someone listened to them. In other words, it seems the problem is how it was accepted, not the lobbyists.
That's not our argument. Our argument is, let's just talk about settlements. Right. Since 1967, it has been the official policy of every American president to oppose settlement building in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Yet no American president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel over those 40 years to stop building settlements. That's not in the American national interest. Let's just go to the Clinton years between the signing of the Oslo Accords in the fall of 1993 and the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the fall of 2000. During that 7-year period, the Israelis confiscated 40,000 acres of Palestinian territory. They built 250 miles of connector and bypass roads. They doubled the number of settlers in the occupied territories, and they built 30 new settlements. This is despite the fact that you were at the height of the Oslo peace process and trying to create some sort of Palestinian entity or Palestinian state that could finally bring an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yet Bill Clinton was in no position to stop that from happening. Why was that the case? It was because of the power of the Israel lobby. In fact, again, no president since 1967 has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements because of the lobby. So this problem goes way back in time. Even if you want to make the case that Israel was a strategic asset during the Cold War, the fact is that Israel was building settlements during the Cold War against the wishes of every American president. This was not in their national interest. It's not in their national interest today. And by the way, it's not in Israel's interest either. But this problem is not a recent one, and it's not linked in any meaningful way to the sudden emergence of the neoconservatives in the Bush administration.
Let me move, if I could, in the last minutes we have here, to one of the things in your book. I told you there were things I cheered you on about. There are things that I found a little maddening. One of the things I'm just going to say, because I wrote it down here and I just want to mention that I found maddening, on page 26 of your book, you talk about aid to Israel. You're building the case of how extraordinary the American support is for Israel, and you mention that the American government gives almost $3 billion a year in direct foreign assistance to Israel. And then you go on to make the argument that there's lots of indirect forms of assistance, and so which actually should be much higher. And you mention that it's about 2% of Israel's GDP. I'm reading here from Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. And you go on to say that that's about $500 per year for each Israeli. And then you compare the American aid to Egypt, and you note that it's only $20 a person in Egypt, and you go on to compare U.S. aid to other countries in the per-person dollars. I gotta say, I'm just kind of being direct, as I told you as I was going to be. The amount of the Congressional Research Service says the amount of U.S. aid to foreign countries in 2004 was $18 billion for Iraq. Let's leave that because that's an outlier. That's the war. $2.6 billion to Israel. $1.8 billion to Egypt. 1.7 to Afghanistan, and 0.56, half a billion to Jordan. No place, John, do you ever give the actual dollar amount of aid to Egypt. It's 2.6 to Israel, 1.8 to Egypt. You do it only in per-person forms, and I got to say, I felt manipulated by that. Put the raw numbers, then do it in per person, but nobody characterizes this in per person dollars. It's always direct support to the country. It seems like you're kind of twisting it to make a point, I got to say.
I didn't see it that way. And we did talk about aid to Egypt and aid to Jordan. I can't remember whether we put the actual numbers in.
You did not. I checked 4 times.
Okay.
Okay. Let me just deal with a bigger issue that I got. And it's an interesting thing, because if you're right about this, then, wow, this blows the top off of your argument, I think, and really makes it something that every American needs to be talking about even more than they are. And that is the role of Israel in anti-American terrorism around the world. And now, as someone who's traveled, as I said earlier, I've been to Iraq, I've been to Iran several times. You hear, there's no doubt that anti-Israel sentiment is a huge part of attitudes in anti-terrorist and terrorist views toward the United States. The issue that I want to kind of ask you about, let me just read you from page 64 of your book. The United States has a terrorism problem in good part because it has long been so supportive of Israel. That's a soft phrase, good part. How, then you go on, you seem to say it's a majority reason, or if not the dominant reason. What's your actual view on that?
I don't think we said it was the dominant reason.
No, you said good part. I'm asking kind of what
do
you actually...
we said it was one of the main factors. And we talked at some length about the effect of America's support for Israel's policies against the Palestinians, the effect of that on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Osama bin Laden himself, and how that affected what happened on 9/11. But we went to great lengths to make it clear that Osama bin Laden had other grievances against us. For example, the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, American support for repressive regimes in the region, U.S. sanctions against Iraq, and they were main causes of the terrorist attacks on 9/11 as well.
I'm delighted to hear you say that, because that was the thing that I found most missing. You bring up bin Laden's grievances with Saudi Arabia on page 65 of your book. It gets half in a positive. I could turn to page 65 if I want to read it, but I'll save us all the time. And you mentioned that it was there, and then you move on. In the midst of, it's an 11, sorry for doing the math on you here, but it's an 11-page argument you make, and you never mention, I got a bin Laden quote here from 1998, I won't read you, one from 1999, I won't read you in time. In both of them, he puts Al-Aqsa exactly next to Mecca. The Nation of Muhammad, here's one from 1999 to time. The Nation of Muhammad has responded to this appeal if the instigation for jihad against the Jews and the Americans in order to liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course is on the Temple Mount in the middle of Jerusalem, controlled generally by Israel, though the Muslim Authority, the Waqf, controls the top of the Temple Mount, of course, and the Holy Kaaba, Islamic shrines in the Middle East. In other words, he equates in that argument many times the Israeli control of the Palestinians. And let me just say, you make a great point in saying the kind of knee-jerk views that a lot of people, and I think I probably had some of this, that his adopting of the Palestinian cause was late. You show that it goes early, but he, from my knowledge of his quotations, which is not as extensive perhaps as it might be, he never eliminates the Saudi cause, and that's a big thing that's being, I have to say, downplayed a bit in your argument.
Well, we didn't mean to downplay it. This is obviously a book that focuses on Israel and is the Israel lobby. And we were dealing with the claim that many supporters of Israel make, which is that the events of 9/11 had nothing to do with American support for Israel's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. We were challenging that. We were just trying to show that that's not true. But at the same time, we tried to make it clear that there were other factors that were motivating Osama bin Laden. There's just simply no question about that. Now, we understood full well that people like you would be out there saying that we didn't pay it enough attention, and we tried to sort of protect ourselves, and maybe we didn't do a good enough job. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look at the text. I can't remember in detail exactly what we said, but we were aware of your criticism and went to great lengths to sort of head the problem off at the pass.
You brought up Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and leaving aside the issue of how reliable his statements were, I heard some conversation about that today in the media. You quote him saying, and you quote Ramza Youssef in the 93 case. There's a great story you have about that's taken from, I think it's Steve Call's book, about how that was the only explanation he gave when he was flying back to go on trial in America. That's a great story. You have a quote from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in your book.
Well, that quote's from the 9/11 Commission report.
From the 9/11 Commission, and then you quote him, remind me what the quote says, because I don't have it in front of me.
The Khalid Sheikh Mohammed?
Yeah.
He says that what motivated him was not any animosity towards the United States growing out of the time that he spent here in the United States as a student, but what motivated him to attack us on September 11th was American support for Israel's treatment of the Palestinians.
And then there's a sentence in your book, which I did cut and paste into my notes. It is hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role of that U.S. support for Israel. It is hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role of that U.S. support for Israel played in inspiring the 9/11 attacks. And this is in a whole conversation in your book about the 9/11 Commission. Let me quote you from the 9/11 Commission. Bin Laden's grievance with the United States may have started in reaction to specific U.S. policies, but it quickly became far deeper. To the second question, what America could do, al-Qaeda's answer was that America should abandon the Middle East, convert to Islam, and end the immorality and godlessness of its society and culture. And it goes on. And there's another quote on the same page, the 9/11 Commission, talking about they say that America had attacked Islam. America is responsible for all conflicts involving Muslims. Thus, Americans are blamed when Israelis fight with Palestinians, when Russians fight with Chechens, when the Indians fight with the Kashmiri Muslims, and when the Philippine government fights ethnic Muslims in its southern islands. I think I understand you're trying to piece together and to make a case that the Israel lobby's influence has been diminished, but I feel like that is not really a characterization of what the 9/11 Commission said. It put it into a much broader context, and nowhere can they be said to say that terrorism or 9/11 was in good part because of America's support of Israel. I think you overstate the case.
I didn't say, or we didn't say, that the 9/11 Commission report said that. We used the 9/11 Commission report to tease out what Osama bin Laden's thinking was about the U.S.-Israeli relationship and how that affected 9/11, and what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's thinking was. The fact of the matter is that the 9/11 Commission report didn't address in any meaningful way what the causes of the attack were.
We agreed that this would be about an hour. We're at an hour, and I would like to pivot from my reading of your book to ask you about some of the events in the news today as we're wrapping up. The conference has just taken place in Annapolis, and there's been a wide kind of conversation about what this means. I blogged about it on Feiler Faster today, saying that the Israelis seem to be taking it more seriously than the Americans seem to be taking it. What is, I mean, it'd be silly for me not to ask you, what is your take? I mean, how does what is taking place in Annapolis, I'm not sure this was the idea of the Israel lobby, probably once it came up, the Condi Rice pushed it, the Israel lobby, like anybody else, would want to maximize its own gains, which some people think that they did. How does this fit in now that we're kind of in a I think this Annapolis event is really the first event, maybe, of the post-Iraq War Middle East. What is your take on how this fits into your thesis?
Well, I'd make 2 points, Bruce. First of all, we argue in the book that it's long been in America's interest to end the building of settlements in the occupied territories, to get the Israelis to pull out of almost all the occupied territories and to create a viable Palestinian state. And the Secretary of State, Condi Rice, has effectively said that is the case. So I think that what the Bush administration is now trying to do is consistent with the basic argument that we're making in the book about what is a desirable American policy vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Second point I would make is that we argue that the only way this is ever going to happen is if the United States, and in this case the Bush administration, puts significant pressure on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories and allow for the creation of a Palestinian state. But that's not going to happen, and it's not going to happen in large part because of the power of the lobby. And I think if you look at what's happened in the run-up to Annapolis and at Annapolis itself, you will see that the Bush administration is not going to put any serious pressure on Israel. And the end result is that Israel is going to go on building settlements and colonizing the West Bank. And this is going to be bad for the United States, and it's going to be bad for Israel. One of the principal arguments that we make in the book, and we often make when we go talk to audiences, is that Israel is rapidly reaching the point where it's going to create an apartheid state. They're going to basically own the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the Palestinians are going to be locked in a handful of small statelets where the Israelis control the borders around those statelets, the air above and the water underneath. And it's going to look more and more like South Africa. And people talk about this all the time in private. Some people are brave enough, like Jimmy Carter, to talk about it in public. But the fact is that's the direction that Israel is headed. And this is, in our opinion, a disaster for the United States. It's a disaster for Israel, and it's an even bigger disaster for the Palestinians. So we think it would be a good idea if the United States could put an end to Israel's colonization of the occupied territories and again allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state. And I think what Condi Rice and President Bush are trying to do is in the spirit of that line of argument. But again, the problem is that it's not going to happen, and it's not going to happen because the lobby is not going to allow any president or Secretary of State to put any meaningful pressure on Israel, and that's the only way it's going to happen.
Okay, so let me apologize if there's been an edit in the thing here. It's because my phone died and I switched phones, and I'm going to wrap up with my last couple of questions here.
Bruce, we can't go too much longer, though.
I know we're not going to go too much longer. I'm going to make one point, and that is, so the fact that Israel didn't want this lobby to exist, this conference to exist, but you say it supports you. Is that because of a decline of influence in the Israel lobby, would you say? A decline of influence of the neoconservatives in the Bush administration, both or neither?
Well, I don't think that the lobby was against the conference. The key question here is whether the United States is going to put pressure on Israel to do something that the Israeli government doesn't want to do. That's what the lobby's mainly concerned about, and there's no evidence that that's going to happen. The lobby understood, as most Americans understood, and most Israelis understood, that this conference was not a serious attempt to negotiate a settlement to this conflict. It was basically a giant...
Give Annapolis a chance. Give Annapolis a chance. Okay, last question for you. I know you got to go. Thank you for all the time. Quickly, on a scale of they rank lobby groups, of course, rank members of Congress based on their support for their causes. Let's just quickly go through on a scale of 1 to 100. I'd like you to rank, from the Israel lobby's point of view, the presidential candidates. Giuliani, he's got to be 100, right?
Again, it's impossible to do this in large part because you're assuming that the Israel lobby has a monolithic view of the candidates' views about Israel, and that's not true. For example, a number of organizations in the lobby favor a two-state solution, and some of the candidates are not in favor of a two-state solution. So you're going to find significant variation in how the various organizations in the lobby think about the presidential candidates.
I couldn't agree more. I wish that idea was more in your book, I got to say. Okay, well then we will all watch it because I'm just curious. Obviously, Giuliani is surrounding himself with a lot of the neoconservatives. I think Romney's yet to be turned. There's skepticism that I was more interested in about Clinton and certainly about Obama in the kind of Israel lobby members that I know. There is definitely skepticism and concern about that.
But let's just assume that Obama was willing to get tough with the Israelis and that he was willing to push much harder than any of the other candidates to get the Israelis to leave the occupied territories and allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state. Our argument is that that would be the best policy for Israel. See, the problem that many supporters of Israel have is that they think that unconditional support for Israel is good for Israel. In other words, no matter what Israel does, the United States backs it, and that's a good thing for Israel. We don't believe that. We believe that Israel is a normal country. And like all countries, it sometimes pursues foolish policies. And when states pursue foolish policies, it makes good sense for other states to cut off assistance and to do what they can to get that state to change its behavior. It would have been much better for Israel if, starting in 1967, American presidents were free to tell the Israelis they cannot build settlements on the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. And if they did build any settlements, that they had to cease building them and remove the ones that existed. But that was impossible because of the power of the lobby. And the end result is a situation that's not good for Israel. So Barack Obama, in this hypothetical situation, if he's tough-minded with regard to Israel, would be the best president that Israel could ask for.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but I certainly agree with your larger point, and that is we have to end, speaking as an American Jew, we have to end Israel, right or wrong, as the policy of American Judaism. It comes out of guilt. It comes out of feeling that we're not living in Israel and making the personal daily sacrifices, and therefore we have to set the standard. And to me, the chief reason that Israel, right or wrong, is not the right policy for American Jews can be seen by going to Israel and meeting Israeli Jews who certainly don't have it there. The most vociferous, vocal, strong-willed, passionate critics of Israel can be found in Israel. And that should be the standard for all of us, and certainly for American Jews and for American Christians who support Israel. So on that note of agreement, let me thank you again, John Mearsheimer. Here's your book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. My best to your colleague, Stephen Walt, and happy holidays.
Same to you, Bruce. I appreciate it very much.
What a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.